what I want to say on the record here in the Senate today is that this is not the America that I believed in. This is not the America that I took the oath to serve. This is not the America that our Constitution lays out, and this is not the America that the American people voted for. This is unconstitutional, it is unlawful, and it is immoral. No U.S. citizen, no human should be subjected to what you all have been subjected to. No person in our community should be afraid to leave their house. I know grandparents who've lived here almost their entire lives who are afraid to go grocery shopping right now. Little kids who are afraid to go to school because they don't know if their parents are going to pick them up at the end of the day. This is not okay. This is not okay. And while we are in the minority here in the Senate and in the House as Democrats, and we know that our colleagues across the aisle are not only not stopping this, but enabling it and participating in the rhetoric that is arming the administration to continue to make these violations of due process and of your rights and the American people's rights, I just want to say once again on the record, as I often do, we're going to hold them accountable. And whether it happens today, tomorrow, next year, when we win back the House, when we win back the Senate, and when we win back the presidency, we will hold these.
You just heard it from her own mouth, the raw moral clarity that we need desperately in this moment, when the American experiment teeters on the precipice of authoritarianism. And I want you to understand something absolutely critical before we dive into the full weight of what these words mean, because what Representative Stansbury just articulated on the Senate floor is not merely a political statement. It is a constitutional alarm bell ringing so loudly that history itself will judge whether we were awake enough to hear it. We've identified 22 gun-related incidents involving federal immigration agents, including 9 shootings as of December 12, and wait until I tell you what that really means for the fabric of our democracy, because a teaching assistant named Mara Martinez was shot 5 times by federal agents who shouted, "Do something, bitch," before opening fire, and she is an American citizen, and this is happening right now in our cities, while grandparents who have lived here almost their entire lives are afraid to buy groceries and children wake up every morning, not knowing if their parents will be there at the end of the school day. But hold on, because this gets so much worse, and I need you to understand the systematic nature of what is unfolding. Stephen Miller called a meeting with ICE senior officials in May, demanding 1 million deportations in Trump's first year, and a tripling of arrest efforts to a target of 3,000 arrests per day. And when I tell you that this represents the most comprehensive assault on human dignity and constitutional rights in modern American history, I am not engaging in hyperbole. I am describing the empirical reality of what scholars of authoritarianism have warned about for decades, because what we are witnessing is the weaponization of state power against the most vulnerable populations in service of an explicitly white nationalist agenda, and one immigration advocate said plainly that the entire anti-immigrant platform is designed to make America white again, which is not some fringe interpretation but the obvious conclusion when you examine Trump ending a cabinet meeting by unleashing a tirade against Minnesota's Somali population, saying they should go back to where they came from. Rhetoric that echoes the darkest chapters of American xenophobia and European fascism, and I need you to stay with me because the connections between this moment and historical patterns of democratic collapse are so chilling that they demand our complete attention. Representative Stansbury speaks of unconstitutionality, and she is absolutely correct in ways that should terrify anyone who has even a passing familiarity with the Fourth Amendment, because ICE has considerable authority to arrest and detain individuals in public spaces for civil immigration violations without a judge's warrant, and this warrantless arrest authority applies specifically to civil immigration enforcement, which means we have created a parallel system of law enforcement that operates outside the constitutional protections that supposedly define American justice, and when federal agents can stop you on the street, demand your papers and detain you indefinitely without judicial oversight, we have fundamentally abandoned the principles that the founders enshrined to prevent exactly this kind of tyranny. One man showed federal agents his work permit, and an officer told him, "This means nothing to us. For us you are still an illegal," which is not merely bureaucratic cruelty, but the explicit rejection of legal status and due process, the very foundations upon which any legitimate legal system must rest, and the fact that this is happening systematically across dozens of cities tells you that this is policy, not aberration. But wait, because I haven't even gotten to the most explosive part yet, the part that should have every single person who claims to care about American values out in the streets right now, because the administration has set a daily arrest quota of 3,000 undocumented immigrants, and quotas, let me be absolutely clear about this, Quotas represent the transformation of human beings into numerical targets, the reduction of individuals with families and dreams and constitutional rights into data points in a spreadsheet designed to satisfy the sadistic arithmetic of white supremacist policy goals, and more than 65,000 people were in ICE detention as of mid-November, which exceeds the population of entire American cities and represents a scale of incarceration for civil violations that should shock the conscience of anyone who understands that the United States already operates the largest carceral system in human history. The Congresswoman talks about families living in fear, and I want you to really sit with what that means in material terms, not as abstraction but as lived reality, because Chicago's predominantly Latino neighborhoods have seen businesses report that it's dead out there, since Operation Midway Blitz led to more than 3,000 arrests, which means entire communities are being economically strangled by state terror. And yes, I use that term precisely because what else do you call it, when thousands of parents, teachers, clergy, and community organizers have sought training on what to do when they see an immigration raid unfold, when people have to learn how to identify unmarked federal vehicles by the make and model, when neighborhoods develop warning systems like they're preparing for air raids, and the comparison is not hyperbolic, when you understand that fascism does not arrive all at once but through the gradual normalization of state violence against targeted populations. Now here's where this becomes not just morally unconscionable, but constitutionally indefensible in ways that every legal scholar worth their salt should be screaming about, because federal immigration enforcement policies have resulted in the documented arrest, detention, and removal of American citizens, and as of October 2025, the U.S. government was not tracking the number of detained or missing citizens, and the deportation of U.S. citizens from the United States is illegal, which means the Trump administration is engaged in systematic kidnapping of American citizens, and they are not even bothering to keep records, and when state power operates without accountability or documentation, you have entered the realm of disappeared persons, a phenomenon we associate with military dictatorships in Latin America during the Cold War, and I am not making that comparison lightly, because the parallels are historically precise. Representative Stansbury says this is not the America that the Constitution lays out, and she is invoking a tradition of constitutional interpretation that recognizes due process as the bedrock protection against arbitrary state power, a principle that traces back through centuries of Anglo-American jurisprudence and finds its fullest expression in the 14th Amendment's guarantee that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that word person is crucial because the founders understood that rights inhere in humanity itself, not in citizenship status, which is why every major Supreme Court decision on this question has affirmed that undocumented immigrants possess constitutional rights, but the Trump administration has simply decided to ignore constitutional law and proceed as if the constraints that bind democratic governance do not apply to them, which is the textbook definition of authoritarianism. 53% of Americans now say the administration is doing too much when it comes to deportations, up from 44% in March, and this is critically important because it means public opinion is shifting as people witness the actual human cost of these policies, and even more striking, 86% of Democrats say the administration is doing too much, up 11 percentage points since March, while 20% of Republicans now say this, up 7 points, which tells you that the moral clarity of this moment is beginning to penetrate even the partisan fog, because when you see Hispanic Latino voters who gave Trump record gains in 2024 swinging back to Democrats in recent off-year elections, you are watching communities directly affected by these policies reject the politics of cruelty at the ballot box, which is exactly how democratic accountability is supposed to function, but the question is whether electoral consequences will arrive in time to prevent the permanent damage being done to constitutional norms and human lives. The Congresswoman speaks of children afraid to go to school, and I want to unpack the long-term psychological and social devastation this represents, because the scholarship on trauma in immigrant communities is unequivocal, that this kind of sustained state-sponsored terror produces intergenerational harm, the fracturing of social trust, the undermining of educational attainment, the creation of an entire generation of young people who learn that the state is not a source of protection, but an existential threat. And this is not collateral damage but the intended effect, because the purpose of these raids is not actually to remove every undocumented person, which would be logistically impossible and economically catastrophic, but to create a climate of fear so pervasive that entire communities self-deport or retreat into the shadows. The Department of Homeland Security said that more than 2.5 million people have left the country since Trump returned to office, including more than 605,000 who were deported and 1.9 million who voluntarily self-deported, and that word voluntary should be in the largest scare quotes imaginable, because there is nothing voluntary about fleeing your home under threat of detention in jail-like conditions where cells hold 80 people in concrete rooms with inadequate food and freezing temperatures. Now we need to talk about the enabling role that Republicans are playing in all of this, because Representative Stansbury correctly identifies that her colleagues across the aisle are not only not stopping this, but enabling it and participating in the rhetoric that is arming the administration, and this is where the complicity becomes undeniable, because ICE has signed more than 1,100 agreements with state and local law enforcement to perform federal immigration functions as of November 2025, a sharp increase from the 135 agreements in December 2024, which means Republican governors and sheriffs across the country have voluntarily transformed their police forces into deportation squads, creating what amounts to a federalized network of immigration enforcement that brings the power of the state directly into communities in ways that bypass every sanctuary city protection and every local democratic decision about how law enforcement should operate, and this is the infrastructure of authoritarianism being built in real time. Mayors and local officials aren't just criticizing ICE raids in their cities, they're making life harder for federal law enforcement, and cities are finding ways to push back on unwanted immigration enforcement, which represents the kind of federalist resistance that has historically checked federal overreach. And Los Angeles County officials approved an emergency declaration that will cover living expenses for people who miss work because they fear immigration raids, and started accepting requests for aid in December, which is local government stepping in to mitigate the economic devastation caused by federal terrorism. Because yes, that is what this is. The deliberate use of fear and violence to achieve political ends. New York saw over several dozen ICE agents congregate before hundreds of protesters showed up to block their raid, which demonstrates that popular resistance is possible when communities organize. But the question is whether these scattered acts of resistance can coalesce into the sustained mass movement necessary to roll back these policies. The Congresswoman promises accountability, and this is where we need to talk seriously about what that means in practical terms. Because accountability in a democratic system comes through multiple channels, including electoral defeat, legislative investigation, judicial restraint, and ultimately criminal prosecution for violations of civil rights, and every single one of these mechanisms must be deployed if we are serious about preventing the normalization of what is happening right now. A former senior civil rights litigator at the Justice Department who now teaches at Georgetown Law said after examining incidents that these are probably shootings that did not need to happen, and experts say the number of gun-related incidents underscores excessive force, noting that while Trump gave immigration agencies justification to act on their worst impulses, the crackdown has exacerbated a pre-existing culture of impunity, and a previous analysis found that immigration agents recklessly fire their weapons and are rarely prosecuted for it, which means we are dealing with law enforcement that operates above the law, accountable to no one, which is precisely the condition that the Bill of Rights was designed to prevent. When Representative Stansbury says we're going to hold them accountable, she is articulating not just a political promise but a constitutional obligation, because if we allow federal agents to terrorize communities, shoot American citizens, detain people without due process, and deport individuals including American citizens to foreign countries, all without consequence, then we have surrendered the fundamental premise that ours is a government of laws and not of men, a principle that John Adams identified as the essence of Republican government, and that has served as the theoretical foundation for American constitutionalism since the founding. California's Attorney General claims that 80% of the state's legal challenges against immigration executive orders and policies from Trump's first term were successful, and he's very confident they will block major efforts and blunt some of the worst pulled for which tells you that the courts remain a viable avenue for resistance, but it also tells you that we should have learned from the first Trump administration that judicial victories, while essential, are not sufficient if the executive branch simply ignores court orders or finds ways to circumvent them through bureaucratic maneuvering. Federal immigration agents have reportedly begun operations targeting the Somali community in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, and this is part of a pattern where Minnesota is targeted by the Trump administration, with Trump having repeatedly criticized the state's large Somali population, which makes explicit that these enforcement actions are not about public safety or rule of law, but about targeting specific ethnic and religious communities for persecution. And when you combine this with Trump saying specifically that the U.S. should welcome more people from countries like Norway, Denmark, and Switzerland, the white supremacist ideology driving these policies becomes impossible to deny, and we should call it what it is without euphemism or qualification, because the historical record is unambiguous, that when governments begin selecting which populations deserve legal protection based on their ethnicity and national origin, You are watching the early stages of ethnic cleansing. The rhetoric matters enormously here, and I want you to understand how language functions to dehumanize and prepare populations for acceptance of atrocities, because